Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast, presented by Strategic Treasurer, your source for interesting Treasury news, analysis, and insights in your car, at the gym, or wherever you decide to tune in.
Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast. This is Craig Jeffery. On today's podcast, we have Kevin Peek, who's with Truist, and Stephanie Villatoro, who's with International Justice Mission. Welcome to the podcast, Kevin and Stephanie.
Hey, Craig. Glad to be here.
It's a pleasure to be here, Craig.
It's so good to talk with both of you. You know, we've had some conversations in preparation for this. You know, nonprofit organizations have similarities and differences with, for-profit organizations, and it should be a really fun conversation talking about these differences. Truist is obviously a bank, and International Justice Mission is a nonprofit. So as we start this discussion, I thought we could begin on the cash management side. What are you finding that's the same, and what's different for operational cash management? Maybe Stephanie, you might want to start first on talking through some of those, and then Kevin, you can jump in. But we'll start with cash management. We'll move through things like borrowing investments, all the way down to stewardship, data privacy as well. But Stephanie, if you could start us off.
Certainly, Craig. Thanks for having us today. I appreciate being able to give back on these podcasts, because Strategic Treasurer does so much to educate the Treasury world at wide. But from a cash management standpoint, between for-profit and nonprofit, the similarity is cash cycles. You have a cash cycle no matter what within an organization or a company, and that varies depending on your product. From a nonprofit standpoint, you're highly dependent upon constituents that are donors. And that cash cycle can be very volatile and has a lot of seasonality. So that's a big difference in how you intake money, and having to have more options for intaking donations. It's not just, an ACH or a wire or a check. There are many different forms of donations that support an organization. Those are non-cash donations. Those are securities. Those are sometimes 401ks, or even living wills. When someone passes away, we get donations that way as well. So the biggest difference on a cash management, I would say, is on the receipt side. I mean, you're doing vendor payments just the same as you would do at any organization. That's very similar in fashion. But the biggest difference is definitely on the intake receipt side.
And you talked about seasonality. Is that tend towards the end of the year as people are figuring out where they're going to give, or are there some other elements that impact that type of seasonality that you've seen?
The seasonality definitely is higher from the standpoint of intaking the majority of donations at year end, when everyone's trying to plan for their taxes for the following year, and wanting to get those last minute donations in. So we do have a large intake that starts around mid-November through the end of the year. And some of that flows in past into January, because we go by postmark date if it's a check. The other seasonality, I would say, is grants and when those come in. So those are larger dollar, less frequent, and they can come around any time of the year for different projects that we might be working on.
Interesting. Yeah, as you talked about accepting different types of payments like 401ks, living wills, or securities being transferred over. One of the things that maybe not this year, but in prior years, there certainly was a lot of money made on digital currency. Did you have to be as flexible enough to accept things like that? And what about furniture and real estate?
We do accept non-cash donations like real estate. An example would be a vehicle, donating a vehicle, and we have a third party that sells it, and that goes towards the fair market value as what you receive as the donation value. For non-cash items like cryptocurrency, right before the big crash of crypto, we started accepting crypto, got a couple donations, and then it fell off the map. We have that capability, but the biggest thing I see with cash donations and cryptocurrency around the world, it gets into a little bit of know your customer constraints for compliance with banks and anti-money laundering. So you may be able to accept it in some countries, but not in others.
Interesting. Interesting. Kevin, so Stephanie talked about some of the inflows and outflows. What do you see that's the same and different? Anything else?
Thanks, Craig. Yeah, I would agree with Stephanie. I tend to work more with clients, and we'll talk more about that later. I know we talk about investments, but one of the things, and I agree with Stephanie about the lumpiness of cash. And while you might have some donors who pay with good regularity, you also have a lot of, and you may know that they're going to give annually, but it's always going to be at the end of the year. So you can do some of that forecasting. But in a corporation, you sell a service, or you sell a widget, or whatever it is your business does, and you can sort of then forecast the cash component of that. But nonprofits don't have that same luxury. So, and again, unless a donor has made a pledge, or unless you have something is coming in, I think there's probably a little bit more. And I think Stephanie would probably agree with this. You're I don't say hoarding cash, but when you think about how many days on hand of cash you want to have, it's different for nonprofits than it is for corporates, because corporates can, I think they can plan their forecasting better. And most nonprofits that we talk to are thinking sort of much more long term about when they think about operating cash. It's a much bigger number as far as time that they want to sort of have cash on hand than it is for corporates. So, but to Stephanie's point, I think how you get the money in and all the cash application and sort of similar fashion, right? The sort of the normal treasury components and how all the accounting pieces. One difference probably is where you have donors who have an endowment, and now you've got to report back to them. It's not just, oh yeah, we got money in. It's now, well, thank you, donor, but now we have to manage giving you data over a long period of time of what we're doing with that money, or how that money is doing, and how it's supporting the mission of the organization. So I think that's, it's a little bit different in how nonprofits work with their clients than it is on the corporate side.
There's more of a link to the mission rather than the product or the service, it sounds like.
That's correct.
I think as we go through discussing what's similar and what's different, letting everybody hear who is talking to the audience. So Kevin, maybe you could just give a quick explanation of the organization you work for and what you do at Truist.
I work for Truist in our foundations and endowments specialty practice. It's a small group within the bank that works exclusively with nonprofit organizations, exclusively with long-term pools of capital, and to some extent operating reserves. So when we think about investments, oftentimes there is sort of some short-term cash where you're looking for, whether you have a capital project or something else, or you might be investing money short-term, 6, 9, 12 months, maybe 1 or 2 years, and then money that you want to invest sort of into perpetuity, right? And the goal of that. So we don't work with any 401k assets, any pension assets, really a defined pools of capital, and we only work with nonprofits. So we're a pretty unique organization, and we love to. Our Truist corporate purpose is to inspire and build better lives in communities. And I think the work that we do really does that, given our focus on working with nonprofits who are supporting our communities.
Thanks, Kevin. And we'll include in the show notes, if there's a particular link on Truist site that touches your area, we'll put that in. Thank you so much. Well, let's continue, Kevin, on the second section, which is about borrowing and investments. Maybe you gave some hints about some of that as well, but what's different and what's the same on the borrowing and investment side?
Yeah, so I think when corporates think about investing, they're going to be thinking about investing in the business, right? They're going to deploy their cash back into the business, whether that's innovation, whether that's increased inventory, whether that's buying additional companies, buybacks, right? How they think about deploying their cash is going to be different than a nonprofit organization who's thinking about how to put that money into their mission, or to put money toward toward endowment, sort of long-term pools, sort of rainy day fund. And so I think that's a little bit different. And I think from a debt standpoint, a lot of corporations, because they have oftentimes a line of credit, or they may have borrowing in place, they don't need to worry about having cash on hand, because they could just go to their line, or again, they've borrowed. And so they're deploying capital, how they think about that differently. Nonprofits, a lot of nonprofit organizations do have a line of credit, and in some cases they have debt. If you think about schools, right? Building big buildings, or, big CapEx kinds of projects for certain types of, churches. But a lot of nonprofit organizations, because they're not deploying the cash as readily back into the business, I think the way they think about their cash, and as we've talked about, just keeping reserves, rainy day fund, not sure, given the lumpiness in many cases of their donor pool, the way they think about cash and think about investment is going to be different than corporates. As you think about cash or a corporation, CFO and CEO and structures in place, and budgeting and planning, that's all sort of, you've got that sort of system and that structure in place. Nonprofit organizations, while they do absolutely have planning, and they have budgeting, and they have forecasting, they also have a board of directors that is, in most cases, much more involved as it relates to investments and who they're going to work with, and how they want to invest, and what their risk tolerance is for investing. And so I think it opens up the organization to more, I don't know if say it's democratization of the process across different constituencies, but it's different than corporates, who are, have a structure in place where, if CFO says X, or, has authority to do something, they can do it. And I think for nonprofit organizations, when it comes to investing and looking at investment policy statement, there's more outside involvement in the process. So I think that's a pretty big difference. And I think there are pros and cons to that, but it is a difference nonetheless.
So that increased amount of, let's say, distributed responsibility for that, Stephanie, is that what you see there too? What other color would you give us on the governance decisions, around investments and even borrowing?
There's definitely a higher level of board intervention with the teams, and at IJM we have subcommittees that we work with, and I'm on the financial subcommittee, and part of the board is on that. So there's a lot of actual direct communication with the board that you would not see in a for-profit entity. So they're much more hands-on, and they do have their other jobs and things, but there's a lot of directive, I would say, from that standpoint.
On the investment side, what other descriptives would you give it to show the difference or similarities? Both you and Kevin have mentioned this need for, let's say, a larger cash reserve or investment reserve to support the unevenness or lumpiness of the donor activity. It doesn't come in steadily. What else would you see here?
There's a big difference on the borrowing side, as well as what he was saying on the cash reserves. And this is the underlying, we don't have products that we're selling where we have the ability to be a good credit risk, to have something to show for it, because it is just donation based. Getting, a credit facility is much more difficult than something that you're doing for growth to bring in more revenue. So that's a main difference on that side. It's more of a working capital, like credit facility or a line of credit. Sometimes it's collateralized. There's other options that you have to do to secure that from a cash flow dip standpoint for that seasonality. So that's a big difference on that. To kind of talk a little bit about that intake of money and that seasonality and that focus on the cash reserves. I speak a lot to different organizations because we share information. COVID was a great year, and what we saw was different organizations, not necessarily IJM, but in general in the charitable organization arena, is they increased cash reserves because they couldn't spend it as fast as they were getting it from their the standpoint of what they already had budgeted. And that was just an anomaly during the years of COVID when everyone was at home. And I think that stemmed from less expenses, not traveling, so on and so forth, where they could give more. That has leveled off in the last year. That's what I see in the difference on that. From the investment standpoint, we are more focused on investing, but also on securing just the capital, like the baseline capital. We're not risky in that sense. And the board does have to approve our policy on investments. And we also, depending on, I don't think we've talked about this before, but we do a lot of, we're preparing for annuity giving. So if someone wants to purchase an annuity where they get a tax benefit and also a benefit later in life, those have state by state regulations of how you actually have to invest those funds. So there's a lot more scrutiny, I would say, from a regulatory compliance from a state level on those funds.
A lot of scrutiny, and it sounds like additional complexity, just like on the receiving cash side. Now you've got the financial product and annuity that's part of it. Anything else, either of you, on, let's say, as we think about the horizon, the time horizon, forecasting, capital planning, maybe debt planning is not as long, but any differences in how far you have to look out compared to, let's say, a general corporation?
Yeah, Craig, one thing I would say, and we didn't really talk about this, many organizations, and I don't know where IJM is in this respect, but a lot of organizations are very dependent on the income that is generated from their investment pool to support their operations. And I think that's something, as we think about, a turbulent market, if your income is down, right? The stock market's down 30%, so you didn't throw off as much income. How many fewer scholarships? How many fewer food baskets? Or, think about a food bank, or, the different missions that these organizations have. Many of them are very dependent, which can lead some organizations to be more risk averse with their investment portfolio, because they've sort of been bitten, a couple of times, or, however, just to go through market cycles. And the challenge with that is, the more risk averse you are, the less likely you are over a long period of time to be able to, take advantage of the market and of your investment pool to generate real returns. And, when someone says to me, "Oh my gosh, look at some of these big, school endowments," I say, yeah, but they also have 25 and 30% of their investment pool in private equity. So not only is that pretty risky, not only is that a long cycle, right, to start to see distributions from those investments, but they're also tying up a lot of their income or a lot of their assets that they're not going to generate any short-term income off of that, or very little. And so it's an interesting sort of push and pull of how risky do you want to be to generate great returns to support your mission, or how risk averse do you want to be to make sure that you can always generate some cash to support your mission. So it sounds like what I heard Stephanie say was, their board really tries to balance that to be, support their mission, but they're not, and I've seen some organizations that are sort of 80-20 when they think about an equity to fixed income allocation. And in 2020, maybe 2021, they looked amazing. 2022, they were probably scrambling from a to fulfill their mission and the income that they received off of their portfolio. So that's something to sort of think about, and something we think about with our clients and in our communities of how can you best manage risk to help achieve your mission with your investment assets.
Many organizations are, net borrowers, or they flip between borrowing and having extra cash. It seems like most or a majority of nonprofits have to be in the positive situation to manage their activity and fulfill their mission. Before we get into staffing and resources, where there might be some differences and similarities there, Stephanie, maybe you could just do a quick overview of what is International Justice Mission and what's your role at IJM?
So my role at IJM is the Global Officer of Treasury. So with that, I'm managing overall liquidity, risk management, policy compliance, and day-to-day operations with the team. IJM as a organization kind of will pull on your heartstrings a little bit, but we are global, but we protect people in poverty from violence. And what does that mean? We do things like combating trafficking, modern day slavery, violence against women and children, and then also police abuse of power. We do that through several different kind of pillars, but by strengthening the justice systems locally, rescuing and restoring victims from violence, bringing the criminals to justice. So we do a lot of prosecution in cases there. And then we like to scale that, for ongoing protection of those local communities.
Well, that's excellent, Stephanie. And I know I've looked at a bunch of that information. It pulls at your heartstrings, like you said, and opens your eyes to a number of the injustices that exist. So we'll make sure we include in the show notes. You can find information about IJM as well. So thank you for jumping on and sharing that. Well, one thing that was different, you introduced yourself as a global officer of Treasury. I know that I don't think there's any corporate group that has that type of title, right? It's like head of Treasury, right, across the globe. When we look at staffing and resources, most staffing groups and corporations they're fairly thinly staffed, and there's challenges, but things may be different. So I'll let either of you go first on this one, or Stephanie, if you want to start, and Kevin, you can jump in because you work with other ones. So what are you seeing on the staffing and resource side in a nonprofit, and how that differs?
From a nonprofit standpoint, I just a few months ago, I was at the Treasurers Roundtable, and what I saw there from just the different groups and what they're dealing with today is thinly staffed. And you're right, that is kind of a standard across the board, even in for-profit world. Treasury is usually thinly staffed, depending on the organization and the financial transactions of that organization. But what I've seen in the last few years, not only are you thinly staffed, but finding temporary assistance or for backfilling maybe, a medical leave, to actually scaling up a little bit as organic growth happens. It's been more of a challenge. There seems to be more of a shortage in finance and accounting staff. And when there's a shortage or a shortfall, those that are looking for jobs have more options. And when you're looking at a nonprofit organization versus a for-profit, there is a difference in what that compensation is going to be like. So that in itself makes it more challenging.
And when you say there's a difference in the compensation, I'm assuming you're saying for-profit might have greater funds and can use that as a means of getting people to sign on. So how important is the mission in recruiting? It's like, hey, maybe you get a little bit less money, but you're helping do that type of activity.
Recruiting in itself, and I can give you an example, but so there are nonprofit organizations out there that are not faith-based. IJM in itself is faith-based. So it adds another difficulty in the recruiting component. Meaning, you might get 10% of those that apply that meet that minimum standard from the faith-based standpoint. So you even take a small percentage of what's available and you reduce it to 10%. So that makes it a little bit more challenging. On the other side of when we're talking about total compensation, there is a definite reduction there based on, a for-profit position of equal value. And I think those that are looking to be in the nonprofit world are more driven, and I see it internally all the time, they're more driven by the mission than they are by the dollar signs. I find that people are more dedicated, will work longer hours for less pay overall because they believe in the mission in itself.
That is interesting. Like the tie into the mission is like a way of, giving to the organization and the mission to make that happen. Really interesting. Kevin, what are you seeing in that area of staffing resources? There's certainly a pretty heavy shortage, and it's it's the employee, if you will, market, or at least it's been that way for a little bit now. What are you seeing?
I would agree with Stephanie, just, everything that she said. And I would maybe even go a step further to say, the nonprofits that we work with are most of the staff, they wear so many more hats than in the corporate world. If you're in accounts payable in a corporate environment, you do accounts payable. If you're in accounts receivable, you do accounts receivable, cash forecast. Right. It's a little bit more siloed. I bet if you ask Stephanie what her day looks like, it's probably, I don't want to speak for her, but, 25, 30, 40% sort of core treasury. And then it's a lot of other things that are helping IJM sort of more from a mission standpoint and thinking about some of those pieces. So Stephanie, I said I wasn't speak for you, then I did. So maybe I'll give you a chance to sort of agree or not. But I know from my perspective, many organizations that we work with, when you talk to the staff about what they do, it's development work, and it's, even, they're not in development, right? Go out and doing fundraising, but there is some piece of that. I think if you're, working for a nonprofit organization, you're, everybody is in a fundraising capacity to some extent. So I think that, and maybe that leads to longer hours. Maybe it's because you feel so passionate about what you do, you're willing to work more hours. Maybe it just feels like it's more because you're wearing so many different hats. But I think that's a pretty big difference in the nonprofit community than it is in the corporate community.
I would agree with you, Kevin. I find myself speaking directly with donors that are making donations that are a little more challenging, helping them through that process. It usually has to do with some type of security, or maybe it's, their will and testament and how we assign that or get information on it. Those are some of the areas. The others, like the development and the back end from our website development, when it has to do with donations to our systems, and then our payment channels and how they all interrelate. There's a lot of different teams that have a piece of the puzzle, and Treasury ends up getting involved because, cash is king as usual, even in a for-profit, but from a donation-based organization, it is very crucial.
Craig, from your experience, I'm not sure how many global treasurers that you've spoken to on the corporate side that are interacting with their clients, right? It's that they're pretty far removed from from that, the different parts of the organization that would be thinking about talking to a client. Treasury would be pretty far down the list on an area that would do that.
Yeah, I think so. There's certainly some examples where they are talking to clients, maybe large customers or large suppliers, but I guess I would see perhaps it's a little more equivalent as the treasurer spending at a for-profit organizations, probably spending a lot more time with their banks for operational needs, for ensuring that they have access to the balance sheet, right? The funding source there. Whereas in the nonprofit, conversations with the donors is maybe somewhat analogous to that, but just not getting your hands dirty, but rolling up your sleeves and doing some of that work. Just pretty interesting to see what some of the differences and similarities are there. Treasury in particular has to be good stewards of the organization's funds, assets, most liquid assets, and stewardship at nonprofits usually takes on a double meaning, right? Funding the mission. How is that looking different? How do organizations, is that a similar look to, let's say, treasury and finance as a cost center, overhead? How is it similar? How might it be different between those two types of organizations?
Yeah, I'll start by saying, when you think about what corporate treasury is doing for the organization, again, many organizations have debt, and if they have a line of credit, it's a question, can you keep that expense as low as possible? So if you can get the cash in the bank and you can, get the money back out, or, borrow less or repay more, there's this constant balance and sort of constant game of trying to manage that, and thinking about forecasting and thinking about, how to budgeting and some of that. It's just different, right? I don't think Stephanie on a daily basis is saying, "Oh my gosh, we got to get this cash applied as quickly as possible." Not I mean, she probably is, but it's probably for different reasons than, oh my gosh, I could reduce my debt expense by doing something differently. So the sort of the mentality around thinking about day-to-day sort of cash management and the work that Treasury is doing is slightly different. I think the philosophy is a little bit different. And to Stephanie's point, sort of more of the hand holding with donors or different types of constituents, many more types of assets that could be coming in the door. And we have clients who want to, or not clients, donors who want to donate a big piece of land. If you're a nonprofit, the first thing you're going to do is say, how quickly can I sell that piece of land? I have no desire to manage that, whether it's timber or, whatever else it might be. I want to convert that to cash. And same thing with crypto, same thing with, any, other type of asset. It's how quickly can I get that converted to cash? Those are things that Stephanie is having to think about in her role that, nobody's trying to say, hey, Walmart bought a bunch of things. They want to pay their vendors in crypto or in some other type of currency. It's going to be cash, right? So people aren't having to think about that on the corporate side versus the nonprofit side.
I'm going to take that in a different way. When I think of stewardship of a mission, and I agree with Kevin 100%, the focus is how do you get it to be liquid from a donation standpoint. We also have to look at liquidity in a multifaceted way. It's not one pool of cash. We have restricted cash, we have non-restricted cash, donor-specific donations, you have grants that might be specific purpose. So you have to actually manage it in buckets. That's a little bit different as well from a for-profit standpoint. But when I'm thinking of stewardship of just funding the mission and business and overhead, I'm thinking like as simple as an ERP system. From a for-profit, you're going to look at what's best for the organization. You're going to pay for it. There's no question. You need to have an accounting system that works well for your type of organization. But when you're looking at overhead for a nonprofit, you will do with less. And instances for that, because people are donating to the mission, an ERP system is not the mission. It is back office management. But you have to still account for that. You still have to run the organization and do your financial statements and your 990s. That still has to be done, and you still have to track that. But what you use may be less than optimal. We actually went out and had specific donors assist us with just upgrading our ERP system. And it was donation specific for systems. So that's something you see that's different from a for-profit versus a nonprofit.
Yeah, that's interesting. Hopefully they didn't spend $30 million of donated time to get the system up and running. Well, it's been a good discussion so far, Stephanie and Kevin. I want to end, instead of final thoughts or comments, I guess we'll make that an interesting item or something that is good to know or understand about, nonprofits. And Kevin, why don't we start with you, and then we'll go to Stephanie.
Yeah, I guess again, because my experience is on the investment side with nonprofit organizations and just how they're thinking, and I guess it just sort of corroborates something that Stephanie said a little bit ago about doing more with less, or maybe not having the optimum, whether it's a tool or whatever's in the, whatever the treasury group might need or the organization might need. Organizations are always thinking about, nonprofit organizations are always thinking about, well, if I spend $1 here, in something that's operational, that's $1 less that I can put toward my mission and, again, scholarship or helping somebody in the community, whatever the organization's, saving one more, child. That I'm happy to be a donor to IJM. Have been for a long time through a good friend of mine. So Stephanie, I don't even know if you even knew that, but I've been a donor for a pretty long time to IJM. And when I think about, gosh, yeah, I as a donor don't really think about, well, yeah, but if Treasury needs a new tool, well, they should probably have it. But But I also think about, well, gosh, but the dollars that I'm giving, I'm really happy that they're going to specific mission of IJM. And so I think that to me is just such an interesting thought of the mindset and the philosophy of nonprofit organizations is how can we do more with less, because that will enable us to support our mission even more. And I think that just is something that's I'm very appreciative of in general with nonprofit organizations. And I think that we as a society, should really applaud that and the effort that nonprofits undertake to make sure that they're spending every dollar and stewarding every dollar as wisely as possible.
Yeah, when you were saying that, it was basically, or in summary, the efficiency of doing more with less is to support the mission in a nonprofit. In a corporation, the efficiency is really an element of both returning profit and supporting scalability. So perhaps similar types of behavior with a different primary motivation for those. Stephanie, how about you? What's an interesting item or something that we should know or think about?
Yeah, I think there's a few that we had talked about before, and I'll point them out. I know we talked a lot about cash and donations and liquidity, but forecasting on top of that is very challenging on the receipt side. So you have you're not selling something, you don't have accounts receivable, you have donors in your system that have made potential promises. And how do you forecast a potential promise? And it's multifaceted in the sense of you have your regular donors that are very steady every month, and then you have those that are the larger donors, mid-level and above, that are more, the timing is unknown. So it's very challenging to forecast when you're going to receive certain types of donations. That's a little more challenging from a nonprofit standpoint for forecasting. Some other little areas that are different and that you have to consider with donors is data privacy as you get into different jurisdictions and laws around the world. I know everyone's familiar with GDPR in the UK, but there's different data privacy laws in every country that we work in. And we actually fundraise in multiple countries. It's not just the US. So we have to keep those data privacy laws in mind, making sure we have all our ducks in a row for our donors and protecting them. And then the last is when we're funding our operations in the different field offices, sometimes sanctions pop up and you can't pay a sanctioned country from a for-profit standpoint. But when you're in a nonprofit doing humanitarian work, there's actually, you have the ability to do it if there's a general license for it out there for the humanitarian work in certain areas of the world. So that's a major difference as well.
Excellent. Kevin and Stephanie, thanks so much for sharing those insights and thoughts. And it was good to talk to you both again after it's been a number of years since we first started working together, and it was good to collaborate on this.
Thanks, Craig. Appreciate your time today.
Yes, thank you, Craig. Thank you, Kevin.
You've reached the end of another episode of the Treasury Update podcast. Be sure to follow Strategic Treasurer on LinkedIn. Just search for Strategic Treasurer. This podcast is provided for informational purposes only, and statements made by Strategic Treasurer LLC on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, consulting, or tax advice. For more information, visit and bookmark strategictreasurer.com.